My husband died 5 years ago. He left a sealed envelope, open strictly in 2026. Yesterday, I opened it. Inside was a note. Go to the garage. There is a secret room under the floor. When I found it and went down. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Callahan, and I am 71 years old. I have lived in the same house in Millbrook, Ohio for 43 years. I raised 2 sons in that house, buried a husband from that house, and sat on the back porch of that house every single morning with a cup of black coffee and watched the light change over the yard, the way only someone with nowhere urgent to be can afford to do. People in town called me steady. My pastor called me resilient. My neighbor Ruth called me stubborn, but she meant it kindly. I called myself tired most days, but the quiet kind of tired, the kind that comes after a long life well lived, not the kind that frightens you. Harold and I had been married for 47 years when he died. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, the way that particular disease tends to be. In March, he told me his back hurt. By August, he was gone. I didn't have time to prepare, and I'm not sure preparation would have helped anyway. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, no matter how much warning you receive. Harold was a good man, a quiet man. He worked for 30 years at the county assessor's office, knew property values the way other men know baseball statistics, and spent his weekends puttering in the garage or tending the vegetable garden along the south fence. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or dramatic declarations. He showed love through actions. A filled gas tank, a replaced smoke detector battery, a cup of coffee waiting on the counter before I even came downstairs. I trusted him completely. I never had a reason not to. After he died, his son from his first marriage, Garrett, came to the funeral with his wife, Pamela. I want to be careful here, because I was raised to speak kindly about the living. But I will say this. Garrett had always looked at Harold's property the way a man looks at something he believes should belong to him. He was civil to me at the funeral. He shook my hand and said the right words, but his eyes moved around my living room like an appraiser's, and Pamela kept asking, in that gentle, suggestive way she had, whether I'd thought about what comes next. I was 58 days a widow at that point. I had not thought about what comes next. I was still thinking about what had just ended. Harold left a will. It was straightforward. The house and everything in it passed to me. The savings account, the small retirement fund, the car, all to me. Garrett received a modest sum, which Harold had set aside years earlier. It was not nothing. It was not what Garrett had apparently expected. He didn't contest the will, but the atmosphere between us changed after the reading. The phone calls became less frequent, then stopped entirely. I told myself that was natural. I told myself grief makes people strange. Life settled into its new shape. I planted the garden in spring. I had Ruth over for dinner on Thursdays. I learned to manage the finances Harold had always handled, discovered I was competent at it, and felt a complicated pride about that discovery. The years passed, 5 of them. And then, last April, I was sorting through the cedar chest at the foot of our bed, looking for a quilt I wanted to give to my granddaughter. And I found the envelope. It had been there the whole time, tucked beneath Harold's old wool sweater, sealed with tape, and written on in his careful hand, open strictly in 2026. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I turned the envelope over and over. It was 2026. It was April of 2026, and Harold had died in 2021, and he had known, had planned, had decided that there was something I should not know for 5 years. Why 5 years? Why not immediately in the will with the lawyer present? Why hide it in a cedar chest like a secret passed between strangers? I didn't open it that night. I put it on the kitchen table and I made dinner and I watched the evening news and I went to bed and I lay in the dark and I thought, Harold, what did you do? The next morning I opened it. The note inside was written on a single index card in his neat, small handwriting. It said, Dot, go to the garage. Under the floor there is a hidden room. I'm sorry I waited. I needed to be sure you were safe first. Everything inside belongs to you. I read it 3 times. Then I put on my coat, walked across the yard in the early morning cold, and opened the garage door. The garage smelled the way it always had. Motor oil, dry wood, the faint ghost of fertilizer from the bags Harold kept stacked against the back wall. His workbench was still there. Tools arranged with the precision of a man who believed order was a form of respect. His old riding mower sat in the corner under a canvas tarp. Nothing had changed. I had not changed anything because I hadn't been able to bring myself to, and also because I hadn't had a reason to. I stood in the center of the concrete floor and looked down. The floor was solid, unbroken, or so it appeared. I walked slowly, the way Harold used to walk when he was looking for something he'd misplaced, methodical and patient. And then, in the far left corner, behind the stack of fertilizer bags, I found it. A seam in the concrete, barely visible. A square, roughly 4 feet across, with a recessed metal ring flush with the surface, painted over to match the surrounding floor. My heart was doing something uncomfortable in my chest. I am a practical woman, and I want to state clearly that I was frightened. Not of something supernatural. I am 71 years old and I have no patience for that kind of fear. But of something real. Of what it might mean that my husband of 47 years had built a hidden room beneath our garage and told no one about it for as long as I had known him. I pulled the fertilizer bags aside. I gripped the ring with both hands. The hatch was heavy, but it moved. It had been recently oiled, which meant Harold had maintained it even in the months when he was already sick, when every movement cost him something. That detail hit me harder than I expected. He had come out here, in pain, and kept this secret ready. Beneath the hatch, a wooden ladder descended into darkness. I found a flashlight on Harold's workbench. Of course he'd left one there. Of course he'd thought of that. And I climbed down. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12. Dry, surprisingly. The walls were lined with wooden shelving, and on those shelves were banker's boxes, perhaps a dozen of them, labeled in Harold's handwriting. There was also a fireproof safe bolted to the floor, a manila envelope taped to its top, and a folding chair positioned in front of it, as though Harold had imagined me sitting there, taking my time. I sat down. I opened the manila envelope first. Inside was a letter, 4 pages in Harold's handwriting, and a separate sheet with a combination. The letter began, Dot, I need to tell you about the Reardon property. I won't recount every word here, but the substance of it was this. In 1987, Harold's father had left him a parcel of land, 11 acres outside of town, near the old Reardon farm road. Harold had never told me because at the time there had been a legal dispute with his brother's estate, and the land had been tied up in litigation. Then the litigation had resolved in Harold's favor, quietly in 1994, and Harold had meant to tell me. But by then he had begun to understand that Garrett, his son from his first marriage, then a teenager, had somehow learned about the land and believed it was coming to him. Harold had said nothing. He had waited. He had watched Garrett's behavior over the years and concluded, slowly and with grief, that Garrett would contest any claim I made to that land the moment Harold was gone. The land, according to the assessor's records Harold had kept in the boxes, was now worth considerably more than 11 acres of Ohio farmland had any right to be. A commercial developer had been buying up parcels in the area for nearly a decade. Harold's 11 acres sat at the center of the projected development corridor. Its assessed value, as of Harold's last research in 2020, was approximately $2.3 million. I sat in that underground room for a long time. The flashlight sat on the shelf beside me, aimed at the ceiling so the light diffused softly, the way Harold used to angle his reading lamp so it wouldn't bother me when I was sleeping. I thought about 47 years of marriage. I thought about the word safe in his note. I needed to be sure you were safe first. 5 years. He had calculated that 5 years was enough time for Garrett to have moved on, stopped watching, stopped waiting. Was he right? I didn't know. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was not going to let this go. Not out of greed. I want that understood. I am not a greedy woman. But Harold had preserved this for me, carefully and at great personal cost, and I was going to honor that. I climbed back up the ladder with the manila envelope tucked under my arm. I replaced the hatch. I put the fertilizer bags back exactly as they were. Then I went inside, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table to think. The first thing I needed was a lawyer. Not the family lawyer who had handled Harold's will. A firm Garrett knew, a firm with connections to Harold's old life. I needed someone new, someone who had no prior relationship with anyone in this situation. I called Ruth that afternoon, not to tell her everything, not yet, but because Ruth's daughter-in-law was a paralegal in Columbus and I needed a name. Ruth's daughter-in-law gave me the name of an attorney named Susan Hart, a property and estate lawyer based in Columbus with 20 years of experience, and, Ruth assured me, a reputation for being thorough. I called her office the following Monday morning and made an appointment for Thursday. I told no one else. I went about my week as normally as I was capable of, watering the garden, going to the grocery store, calling my younger son Patrick to chat about his children. And I kept the manila envelope locked in the small fireproof box I kept in my bedroom closet, the one I'd always used for passports and birth certificates. Susan Hart's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps mid-40s, with a focused, unhurried manner that I liked immediately. I sat across from her desk, folded my hands in my lap, and told her everything. I showed her Harold's letter. I showed her the combination to the safe. I had opened it the day before and found the original deed to the land, the litigation settlement documents from 1994, and a folder of recent appraisal printouts Harold had downloaded and annotated. Susan read through everything with the careful patience of someone who understood that the document in her hands might matter in court. When she finished, she looked up and said, "Mrs. Callahan, do you understand what you have here?" "I believe I do," I said. "This deed is clean. The settlement is valid. The land is yours by right of inheritance through your husband's estate. There is no legitimate challenge available to anyone, provided we file correctly and promptly." She explained the process. We would file a claim with the county to formally transfer the deed into my name. which should have been done at Harold's death, but had not been, because no one knew about it. We would simultaneously request a title search to document the land's history and current value. We would be careful. We would be quiet about it, for as long as quiet was possible. I asked her how long we had before someone might notice. She said that the moment we filed, it became public record. "There's no way to do this invisibly," she said, "but we can move quickly." We filed on a Friday afternoon. By the following Wednesday, my phone rang. It was Garrett. He had not called me in over 2 years. His voice was pleasant in a way that reminded me of Pamela's pleasant voice at Harold's funeral, that particular pleasantness that sits on top of something else entirely. "Dorothy," he said, "how are you? I've been meaning to reach out." "Hello, Garrett," I said. "I heard you've been in touch with an attorney in Columbus." A pause. "I just wanted to make sure everything was all right. Is there anything I can help you with?" I had expected this, or something like it. Susan had warned me that a title search would be visible. What I hadn't expected was how quickly it had happened. 4 business days, which meant Garrett had someone watching, which meant he had been watching for years. "Everything is fine," I said. "Thank you for calling." I hung up and sat with the phone in my hand and felt the full weight of what Harold had been protecting me from. He had known. He had known exactly what Garrett was, and he had spent years engineering a situation in which I could be safe before the fight began. The following Monday, Susan called me with the results of the title search. The land was clean as expected, but she had found something additional, something Harold apparently hadn't known, or perhaps hadn't had time to include in his letter. In 2022, the year after Harold's death, Garrett had filed a quiet title action attempting to claim the Reardon parcel, arguing that Harold had died intestate with respect to that specific asset. The action had been filed in a county court and had been pending for 3 years without resolution. Because there had been no opposing party, no one to contest it, since no one on my side had known the land existed. The case had been proceeding entirely without me. I read Susan's email 3 times. Then I printed it and drove to her office without an appointment, and she saw me immediately because she is that kind of lawyer. We sat together and looked at the court documents, Garrett's attorney's filings, the case number, the procedural history, and I felt something settle in me like concrete hardening. This was not suspicion anymore. This was evidence. Garrett had known about the land, had waited for Harold to die, and had moved to take it through the courts before I could ever discover it existed. "Can we intervene in the existing action?" I asked. "Not only can we," Susan said, "we must, and we have grounds. The deed, the settlement, Harold's letter, all of it establishes your legitimate claim beyond any reasonable dispute." She paused. "Dorothy, I want to be honest with you. This will become contentious. Garrett's attorney will not step back quietly." "I know," I said. I picked up my purse. "Do what needs to be done." Susan filed our intervention in the quiet title action the following week. We attached the deed, the 1994 settlement, Harold's letter, and a sworn affidavit from me detailing the circumstances of discovery. The filing was, in Susan's words, airtight. In my words, it was 47 years of a good man's careful love, finally speaking for itself in a court of law. 3 days later, Garrett came to my house. He didn't call first. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with Pamela, and they knocked on my front door the way people knock when they want to appear casual but have rehearsed it. 2 sharp raps, and then a step back to look unthreatening. I watched them from the kitchen window for a moment before I answered. Pamela was holding a dish covered in foil, a casserole apparently, the props of a social visit. I opened the door. Dorothy. Garrett smiled. Pamela smiled. We were in the area. We brought food. Come in, I said. I did not want them in my house, but I wanted to hear what they had to say, and I had spoken with Susan that morning specifically about this possibility, and she had told me, say nothing about the case. Confirm nothing. Deny nothing. Just listen. We sat at the kitchen table. Pamela unwrapped the casserole, something with chicken, it smelled fine, and poured coffee as though she lived there, which I found I minded more than I'd expected. Garrett talked for a while about nothing, his kids, their new house, the weather in Columbus, and then he said carefully, I heard you've gotten a lawyer involved in the property matter. I have a lawyer, yes, I said. Dorothy. He leaned forward. I want to speak plainly. That land, the Reardon parcel, Dad always meant for that to come to me. You know that. We both know that. He told me so himself before he got sick. His eyes were steady and sincere. He had practiced this. I don't want there to be conflict between us. I would hate for this to get ugly. But if you push forward with this, I'm going to have to protect my interests. And my attorney tells me we have grounds to argue that Harold was not mentally competent in the final years. I set down my coffee cup. Garrett, I said, Harold was sharper at 65 than most men are at 30. And you know that his handling of this asset reflected a deterioration in judgment. He continued, as though I hadn't spoken. I want to give you the opportunity to step back from this voluntarily. It would be better for everyone. Pamela nodded sadly beside him. I looked at them both. A threat wrapped in concern delivered over a chicken casserole. Harold had known exactly who they were. I appreciate you coming, I said. I'll pass your thoughts along to my attorney. Garrett's expression changed. Just for a moment, a fraction of a second, the pleasantness slipped. Dorothy, I'm trying to help you avoid. I heard you, I said. Thank you for the food. They left. I stood in my kitchen and listened to their car back out of the driveway. Then I sat down and my hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the physical reality of confrontation. The body's response to threat regardless of how calm the mind remains. I called Susan immediately and reported every word. She was unsurprised. She told me the competency argument was a common tactic and had essentially no chance of success given Harold's professional record, his clear documentation, and the timeline. They're hoping you'll be frightened into settling, she said. Don't be. That week, Susan filed a motion to dismiss Garrett's quiet title claim on the grounds that it had been filed in bad faith by a party who had no legal standing. She attached documentation showing Garrett had been aware of the contested nature of the land's ownership prior to filing. The motion was aggressive, precise, and exactly right. Then she told me to take a week and rest. You've done the hard part for now, she said. Let the court work. I drove to my sister Carol's house in Indiana and spent 4 days there, sleeping longer than I had in years, eating Carol's cooking, walking in the evenings along the path by the river. I did not think about Garrett or Pamela or the land for entire hours at a time. I thought about Harold and about the folding chair he had placed in that underground room, facing the safe, as though setting a place for me at a table. He had thought of everything. The least I could do was think of the rest. When I returned from Carol's, there was an envelope in my mailbox. It had been sent by Garrett's attorney. A formal letter, not a legal filing, but a good faith communication, as it called itself. The letter outlined a settlement offer. Garrett would drop his quiet title claim, and in return I would agree to split the proceeds from any future sale of the Reardon parcel, 50-50, acknowledging what the letter described as Harold's clear intention to provide for his son. I read the letter on the porch with my coffee, and then I set it on the side table and finished my coffee. There was a robin working the lawn near the garden fence, pulling something from the soil with a business-like persistence I found admirable. I watched it for a while. The offer was not nothing. $1.15 million was not a figure to dismiss without reflection. I am a reasonable woman. I reflected. But the reflection kept returning to the same point. Harold had gone to extraordinary lengths, at great personal effort and over many years, to ensure this inheritance reached me intact and undiminished. A 50-50 split was not what he had built. It was precisely what he had worked to prevent. To accept it would be to hand Garrett exactly what he had tried to take through deception. I forwarded the letter to Susan with a one-line message. My answer is no. Susan called that afternoon. She told me our motion to dismiss had generated what she called judicial interest. The judge had requested supplemental briefing from both parties, which in Susan's reading meant the court was taking our bad faith argument seriously. This is moving in your favor, she said. Hold your position. I told Ruth about the settlement offer that Thursday when she came for dinner. I hadn't told Ruth everything from the beginning. I'd been careful, not wanting to involve her unnecessarily, but I had told her enough, and she had kept it in confidence the way Ruth always kept things. She listened to the whole story that night over pot roast, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Harold loved you very much." "I know," I said. "And you're not going to take that offer?" "No." She nodded as though that settled it. Then she said, "Do you need anything? I mean practically. Are you managing?" The question undid me a little, the way practical kindness from a longtime friend can. I told her I was managing. I told her I had Susan, and Carol had offered to come and stay if things escalated, and my son Patrick knew the broad strokes now. I had finally told him the week before, and he was supportive and careful and had offered to come to Ohio, which I had told him wasn't necessary yet. That was true. I had finally told Patrick. He had taken it with the measured gravity he brought to most things. He was angry on my behalf, which I found I needed someone to be, because I myself was not operating on anger. I was operating on something steadier and colder, a kind of determination that sat below emotion, in the part of you that simply knows what is right and proceeds accordingly. I also, that week, joined a small legal support group for widows navigating estate disputes, which a counselor at my church had quietly mentioned existed. It met on Tuesday evenings at the community center. 6 women, various circumstances, a facilitator, who was a retired social worker. I am not a person who joins groups easily, but I sat there the first Tuesday and listened to a woman named Elaine describe a situation remarkably similar to mine. A stepchild, a hidden asset, a fight she had not chosen but was finishing. And I felt for the first time in months entirely not alone. Garrett and Pamela sent a fruit basket 2 weeks after the settlement letter. No note. I thanked them in a text message and said nothing further. I could feel them watching, waiting for a sign of weakness, some crack in the surface through which doubt might seep. There was no crack. I had sealed it with Harold's index card, the one I kept now in my coat pocket, the one that said, "Everything inside belongs to you." Garrett called on a Saturday morning in October to say he and Pamela were going to be passing through Millbrook. They had friends in the area, he said, purely coincidental, and would I mind if they stopped for an hour? His tone was different this time, softer, more careful. The aggression of the kitchen table visit had been replaced by something that, in another context, might have passed for genuine remorse. I said yes because I was not afraid of them, and because I had spoken with Susan the previous week, and she had told me we were waiting on the court's ruling on our motion, expected within the month. I had nothing to hide and nothing to lose from letting Garrett speak. They arrived at 2 p.m, no casserole this time. They sat in my living room and Garrett looked around at the photographs on the mantel. Harold and me at Carol's wedding, Harold in the vegetable garden, Harold at Patrick's college graduation, with an expression that was either grief or a skillful imitation of it. "Dorothy," he said, "I owe you an apology." I waited. The way I handled this has been wrong. I was angry after Dad died and I felt, cut out. And I let that turn into something I'm not proud of. He paused. "I know you loved my father. I know he loved you. I don't want to be fighting with you over property. It's not who I want to be." Pamela reached over and touched my hand. "We've been praying about this," she said. "We really have. And we feel like the right thing, the Christian thing, is to let go of the legal claim entirely. We're willing to do that." She looked at me with earnest eyes. "All we'd ask is that you consider in your estate planning, not now, not as a legal matter, just personally, informally, acknowledging that Harold had a son. That's all. A gesture of goodwill." There it was. The settlement offer had been 50%. The new ask was softer. Just goodwill. Just a personal, informal acknowledgement. Just a mention in my will, which of course would be legally binding in practice, while remaining deniable as coercion in the moment. I looked at Pamela's hand on mine. I looked at Garrett's careful, sorrowful eyes, and I thought of Harold's note. I needed to be sure you were safe first. He'd not been speaking abstractly. He had known this room, this conversation, this particular performance of grief and reasonableness. "I appreciate what you're saying," I said. "I do. And I have no wish to be at war with you, Garrett. Your father was a good man, and I know he loved you." Garrett's shoulders relaxed slightly. "But I'm not going to make informal arrangements about my estate in a living room conversation," I continued. "If you want to drop the legal claim, I think that would be the right thing to do. And my estate is my own business, and I'll manage it with my attorney and my family the way Harold managed his." The softness left Garrett's face. Not all at once. He was too controlled for that. But it drained, slowly like water, finding the lowest point. Pamela's hand withdrew from mine. Dorothy. His voice was flat now. You're making a mistake. You're an old woman living alone, and this is going to drag on in court for years, and it's going to cost you, and in the end, I said, the court will decide based on the evidence. I stood up. That was the end of the meeting. He stood too, and for a moment he was very still in my living room among Harold's photographs in Harold's house, and I could see the anger in him, hot and close to the surface. He mastered it. He said, I'm fine. We'll see it through then. They left. I locked the front door and stood in the hallway, and I will not pretend I wasn't frightened. I was, not of Garrett physically, he was not that kind of man, but of the machinery of a prolonged legal fight, of the expense, of the sheer grinding weight of being opposed. But the fear had a quality I recognized. It was the kind that doesn't stop you, the kind that clarifies. I went to my desk and wrote Susan a full account of the visit. Then I made dinner, watched the evening news, and went to bed. In the morning, there was work to do. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in November. Susan and I drove to Columbus together in her car, and I watched Ohio November passing outside the window. Gray fields, stripped trees, the sky the particular flat white of the Midwest in autumn, and felt something that was not quite calm, but functioned like it. Harold had prepared for this day from the year he first understood what Garrett intended. I was simply the final step in a plan 40 years in the making. I had not slept well the night before. Not from fear, I want to be precise about that, but from the particular alertness of a person who understands that something long in motion is about to stop. I lay in the dark of Harold's house and went through the facts the way you go through a list before a long trip, checking each item. The deed, the settlement, the letter, the clerk's communication, each one solid, each one real. By the time the alarm went off at 6, I had already been awake for an hour, and I felt strangely prepared, the way you feel after prayer or after a very long exhale. The courtroom was unremarkable. Wood paneling, fluorescent light, the hushed institutional efficiency of a place where serious things are decided without ceremony. Garrett and Pamela sat at the opposing table with their attorney, a man named Vickers I had seen only in photographs. Garrett wore a dark suit and did not look at me when we came in. Pamela sat very straight, her hands folded on the table, dressed in a muted burgundy that I suspected had been chosen carefully. They looked, I thought, like people who had rehearsed looking composed. Susan presented our case in 40 minutes. She was clear, organized, and thorough. The deed, the settlement, Harold's letter, the timeline. She presented evidence, which our investigator had obtained through public records, showing that Garrett had been in contact with a county clerk in 2021, shortly after Harold's death, inquiring about the Reardon parcel's ownership status. That contact had preceded his quiet title filing by 3 months. He had known the land existed. He had moved to claim it knowing that I did not know, exploiting a window of ignorance Harold had tried to close and Garrett had tried to hold open. Vickers objected twice. Judge Osei overruled both times with the brisk precision of someone who had already read the briefs carefully. Then it was Vickers' turn. He argued the competency angle, briefly because he knew it was weak. He argued that Harold's letter was not a legal document and could not substitute for explicit testamentary direction. He argued that the 1994 settlement, while valid, did not automatically transfer the land to Harold's marital estate without additional documentation. Susan stood for rebuttal and addressed each point in turn, methodically, without theater. And then Judge Osei asked Garrett a question directly. She leaned forward slightly and said, "Mr. Garrett Callahan, I'm looking at Exhibit 14, which is your communication with the county clerk's office in September of 2021. In that communication, you described the Reardon parcel as an asset I have reason to believe my father held without documentation. Can you tell me the basis for that belief at the time?" Garrett looked at Vickers. Vickers gave him nothing. "I had conversations with my father," Garrett said. "Your father died in August of 2021. You state in this communication that you have reason to believe. Can you be specific?" We spoke about it generally before he passed." "Before he passed, your father was ill from March of that year. His medical records, which we have in evidence, indicate significant incapacitation beginning in June. Prior to June, do you have documentation of any conversation about this specific parcel?" "Not documentation, no. It was a personal conversation." "I see." Judge Osei made a note. "Mr. Vickers, your client filed a quiet title action in 2022, asserting that his father had died intestate with respect to this asset. Your client now testifies that his father discussed the asset with him personally. Can you help me understand why a son who had been told by his father about this asset would file an intestacy claim rather than, for example, a claim based on his father's express intention?" Vickers stood. "Your Honor, because an intestacy claim requires there to have been no intention expressed," Judge Osei continued, as though he hadn't spoken. "And a claim based on express intention requires evidence of that intention. Which is it, Mr. Vickers?" The room was quiet. I looked at my hands in my lap. I did not look at Garrett because I did not need to. I could hear in the silence the architecture of his argument collapsing. I thought in that silence about all the rooms this story had passed through. My bedroom, where I found the envelope. The garage, cold and smelling of oil. The underground room with its folding chair and its carefully labeled boxes. Susan's glass office building in Columbus. My kitchen table, where Garrett had delivered his threat over chicken casserole. And now this room, fluorescent, ordinary, utterly decisive. Harold had built a path from one to the next. I had only followed it. "Your Honor," Vickers said, "we would request a brief recess." "We'll take 10 minutes," she said. During those 10 minutes, Susan and I sat together in the hallway on a wooden bench, and she said nothing because she understood I didn't need anything said. I watched people move through the corridor, clerks, attorneys, a young man carrying a box of files. And I thought about Harold coming out to the garage in pain to oil a hatch so it would open easily for me. I thought about him sitting in that underground room, writing a 4-page letter to the woman he had been married to for 47 years, explaining, apologizing, and trusting. When we returned, Judge Osei delivered a bench ruling. Garrett's quiet title claim was dismissed with prejudice. The deed to the Reardon parcel was confirmed as a valid asset of Harold Callahan's estate, properly transferred to Dorothy Callahan as the surviving spouse. Court costs were awarded against the filing party. She looked at Garrett as she said it, the way judges sometimes do when they want the ruling to land fully on the person it concerns. Garrett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His hands, flat on the table in front of him, pressed down slightly as if he needed the solidity of the surface beneath him. Pamela stared straight ahead. Neither of them spoke. Vickers gathered his papers with the careful neutrality of a professional who has learned to lose without expression, though I noticed his movements were faster than they needed to be. Garrett did not look at me as we left. Pamela was crying quietly, which surprised me. I had expected anger. The drive back from Columbus was quiet. Susan and I stopped at a diner outside the city, the kind of place with vinyl booths and good pie, and we ordered coffee and she ordered apple pie and I ordered cherry. And she said, "Dorothy, in 20 years of practice, I have rarely seen a case this clean." And I said, "Harold was a careful man." And she said, "He was. He was very careful." And we sat there for a while in the comfortable silence of two women who have just watched something right happen in a courtroom. Outside the diner window, the November fields stretched flat and gray toward the horizon. A grain elevator stood in the middle distance, white against the pale sky. Ohio in winter has a particular kind of beauty that requires patience to appreciate. It doesn't announce itself, it simply persists. I had always loved it. Harold had too. He used to say this was a landscape for people who paid attention, and I had always thought he was talking about farming. But sitting there in that diner booth, I understood he'd been talking about something larger than that. In the weeks that followed, the legal picture resolved itself with the clean efficiency of things that are actually settled. The title to the Reardon parcel was formally recorded in my name. The developer, a Columbus-based firm that had been buying up land in the corridor for years, had in fact been in contact with Harold's estate through an intermediary as early as 2020, and Susan discovered this through the records. When I authorized her to reach out to them formally as the established title holder, they responded within a week. The negotiations took 2 months. I hired a commercial real estate attorney in addition to Susan on Susan's recommendation, because the transaction required a different kind of expertise. I was patient. I did not rush. Harold had waited 5 years for me to be ready. I could wait 2 months for the right number. The land sold in February for $2.1 million. After taxes, legal fees, and the commission to the real estate attorney, I received $1.74 million. I sat at my kitchen table the evening the wire transfer confirmed and looked at the number on my laptop screen for a long time. It was a number Harold had earned, not at a desk, not in a meeting, but through decades of quiet, careful watching, through the patience to see a threat clearly and plan against it not in anger, but in love. I called Patrick that same evening after I had sat with the number long enough that it felt real. He answered on the second ring, the way he always does. I told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mom," in the voice he uses when words are insufficient. And that was enough. We talked for an hour. At some point I found myself laughing, genuinely laughing, about the folding chair in the underground room, about Harold's characteristic practicality even in secrecy. And Patrick laughed too, and it was the first time in a long time that Harold's memory had made me laugh instead of ache. That felt like its own kind of victory. Garrett appealed the court ruling. His attorney filed within the 30-day window as Susan had anticipated. The appellate court took 4 months to review the record and affirmed Judge Osei's ruling without oral argument, which, Susan explained, was the appellate court's way of indicating that the challenge lacked sufficient merit to warrant a hearing. Garrett's appeal was dismissed. His attorney sent a final letter to Susan indicating that her client would pursue no further legal action. I read that letter at my kitchen table, too. It was 2 sentences long. I want to be precise about how I felt, because I think it matters to say it correctly. I did not feel triumph exactly. I felt a deep, settled rightness. The feeling of a door closing properly on its frame after years of sticking. Harold had been cheated of the chance to give me this himself, in the ordinary way, without secrecy or drama or underground rooms. Garrett had taken that from us, but he had not taken the thing itself. He had tried carefully and deliberately for years, and he had failed, and the failure was complete. I donated $50,000 to the hospital in Millbrook that had cared for Harold in his final months. I set aside a trust for my grandchildren's education. I gave a meaningful gift to Patrick, who had supported me through the whole ordeal quietly and without pressure. I bought myself, for the first time in my life, a new car. Nothing extravagant, a sensible sedan in a shade of blue I liked. Because Harold had always handled the car purchases, and I had always felt I should defer to him on it. And I realize now that I didn't need to defer to anyone on a color. Susan and I had lunch together the following spring. A real lunch, not a work lunch. And she brought her daughter, who was applying to law schools, and I told the daughter that the most useful thing a lawyer could do was listen carefully to elderly women, because elderly women were usually paying close attention to things everyone else had stopped watching. Susan laughed. Her daughter wrote something in her phone. The Reardon parcel, all 11 acres, is now the site of a mixed-use commercial development. I drove past it once, in the fall, just to see. There's a coffee shop on the corner. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes and looked at it. The clean new building, the glass storefront, the young couple coming out with cups in their hands, entirely unaware of the history underneath their feet. 11 acres of Ohio farmland that a man had quietly protected for 30 years through litigation and secrecy and a locked room and a sealed envelope and an enormous act of faith in the woman he loved. I thought Harold would have found that funny. He never drank coffee. He always drank tea. Spring came to Millbrook the way it always does. Slowly at first, then all at once. The forsythia along my back fence went yellow overnight in March, and the vegetable garden, which I had let go somewhat during the legal ordeal, called me back to it with the particular insistence of living things that require attention. I spent a long weekend turning the soil and planning the season's planting, and I felt, kneeling in the garden Harold had made, something I can only describe as permission. Permission to continue. Permission to be well. I will not catalog everything that changed in the year that followed, because the truth is that a great deal did not change. I still live in the same house. I still have coffee on the back porch every morning. I still have Ruth for dinner on Thursdays. These things were not broken and did not need replacing. What changed was something interior, a quality of ease that I hadn't known was missing until it returned. I traveled for the first time in 12 years. Carol and I went to Portugal in the fall, a trip we had discussed vaguely since our 30s and never taken. We spent 2 weeks in Lisbon and then drove north along the coast, staying in small hotels, eating things we couldn't identify but loved, walking more than our feet approved of. I called it a trip, and Carol called it a restoration. She wasn't wrong. Patrick and his family visited at Christmas. His children are 9 and 12 now, and they are exactly the kind of children Harold would have spent hours with in the garden, teaching them things in the patient way he had. I watched them at the dinner table and felt the specific happiness of continuity, of a family that holds together across time. My membership in the estate dispute support group had lapsed during the most active legal period, but I returned to it as a volunteer facilitator after the case resolved. There were always new members. There were always women sitting in that room who needed someone to say, "You are not imagining it. You are not alone. You can do this." I had been that woman. Now I could be the other thing. As for Garrett and Pamela, I heard things, as one does in a world connected by family and proximity, even when contact has officially ceased. Garrett's attorney, Vickers, dropped him as a client after the appeal failed. The legal fees from the combined campaign had been substantial. Garrett had financed them, Susan believed, partly through a refinancing of his Columbus home. In the 18 months following the appeal dismissal, Garrett and Pamela separated. The house was sold. I heard this from Harold's niece, who remained in sporadic contact with me and had no particular loyalty to Garrett's side of the story. The separation was, by all accounts, acrimonious. Pamela moved to Phoenix to be near her sister. Garrett moved to a smaller place in a suburb south of Columbus. I do not know what Garrett's daily life looks like now. I do not think about it often, but I will say this. The decisions he made, to watch, to file, to lie in a courtroom, to come to my kitchen table with a casserole and a threat, those decisions had consequences. Not because I pursued consequences against him, but because that is how decisions work. They echo forward. Harold understood that. He had watched Garrett for years and had not acted out of anger. He had acted out of love, in the only direction love was available to him. He could not change who Garrett was. He could only protect what was mine. I planted tomatoes in the same corner of the garden where Harold always planted them. I used his stakes and his ties and his careful spacing. They came in well that summer. "Better than usual," Ruth said. "She's probably right. She usually is." So that is the story of the envelope, the garage, and the room beneath the floor. What would you have done? Would you have opened that envelope? Leave a comment. I read every single one. Share this if it stayed with you. Thank you for listening. Take good care of yourselves. My son brought a buyer to my house and said, "I am selling your house. Pack your things. You are going to live in a nursing home." I smirked but silently signed. He had no idea that the house actually belonged to... Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. The house on Clover Hill Road had been mine for 37 years. I want you to understand that before anything else. 37 years of birthday cakes baked in that kitchen, of screen doors slamming in July, of Christmas lights strung along the porch railing every December without fail. My husband Gerald and I had bought it in 1987, a cream-colored colonial with green shutters and a yard big enough for a vegetable garden and a swing set. Gerald passed in 2014, and after that, the house became something more than a home. It became the last place where I could still hear him, the creak of the third step on the staircase, the way the afternoon light fell through the dining room window at 4 o'clock. I wasn't just living there, I was keeping him alive in every room. My son Derek had never seen it that way. He'd grown up in that house, sure, scraped his knees on that driveway, fought with his father in that living room, slammed that screen door 10,000 times. But Derek had always treated the house the way he treated most things, as an asset, something with a number attached to it. Even as a teenager, he'd had that quality, that cool appraisal of everything around him. I used to think it was ambition. After Gerald died, I understood it was something colder than that. The first warning sign came in the spring of the year before everything happened. Derek had started calling more frequently. Not out of affection, I realized later, but out of assessment. He'd ask how I was feeling, whether my knees still gave me trouble, whether I'd considered downsizing. That word. He used it the way a realtor uses it, smooth and neutral, as if it were simply practical and not an erasure. I told him I was fine. I told him I didn't need to downsize. He'd laugh in that easy way of his and say, "Just thinking about your future, Mom." And I'd feel a small, cold thing move through me, and then ignore it, because that is what mothers do. We ignore the cold thing. We choose the warmth instead. His wife Tiffany had started coming around more, too. Tiffany was Derek's second wife, 10 years younger than him, sharp-featured, with the particular kind of friendliness that is really just surveillance. She brought casseroles. She complimented my curtains. She walked through the rooms with her eyes doing quiet arithmetic. I noticed, but I told myself I was being uncharitable. Tiffany sat across from me at my own kitchen table and said things like, "This place must be so hard to keep up alone." And I'd smile and say it wasn't, and she'd smile back, and there it was. That thing between us that neither of us named. Then came the afternoon in October. I was in the garden pulling the last of the tomato stakes from the ground when I heard a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. A silver sedan. Derek got out first, dressed in a blazer which he never wore to visit me, and behind him came a man I'd never seen. 50s, clipboard, the unmistakable bearing of a man who spent his days walking through other people's living rooms. Derek was smiling, wide and easy. He walked toward me with his hands in his pockets like he was strolling through a park he already owned. "Mom," he said, "this is Craig Ellison. He's a buyer. He's very interested in the property." I stood there holding a tomato steak. The October air was cold and smelled like turned earth. "I'm selling your house," Derek said, still smiling. "You'll go live at Meadowbrook. It's a good facility. I've already toured it. You'll like it." Meadowbrook. I knew Meadowbrook. It was a care facility 20 minutes away, the kind of place where people went when their families had run out of patience for them, where people went to wait. Craig Ellison had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. He glanced at his clipboard. I looked at my son. I looked at the house behind him. The green shutters, the porch railing, the window of the dining room where Gerald's afternoon light still fell. I thought about what was actually true, legally and factually, about who owned the ground we were all standing on. And I felt something settle in me, not rage, not panic, something much quieter and much more dangerous than either. I set down the tomato steak. I went inside. I found the papers Derek slid across my kitchen table, and I looked at them for a long moment, and then I smiled, just slightly, just to myself, and I signed them. Derek thought he'd won something. He had no idea what he'd actually just started. I didn't sleep that night. That wasn't unusual. I was 70 years old and sleep had become a negotiation rather than a certainty. But that particular night I lay awake for a different reason. I lay in the bed Gerald and I had shared for 26 years, in the room where the ceiling still had a water stain shaped like the state of Florida, And I stared at it and I thought, I am a methodical person. People who knew me in my working years, I spent 22 years as an administrative coordinator at a regional hospital, would have said the same. Not fast, not flashy, but thorough. I do not miss details, and the detail that Derek had missed, the one he had been missing for 11 years, was something I had never corrected him on, because he had never asked and I had never offered. Let me explain the legal reality of 4417 Clover Hill Road. When Gerald and I bought the house in 1987, we took title as joint tenants with right of survivorship, standard for married couples. When Gerald died in 2014, the title passed to me entirely, automatically. Simple enough. But in 2015, on the advice of my estate attorney, Patricia Sohn, I had done something quiet and significant. I had transferred the property into a revocable living trust, the Gerald and Marilyn Hart Family Trust, naming myself as both grantor and trustee, with my daughter-in-law from my first son and my daughter Susan as successor trustees. The purpose was straightforward. Avoid probate, protect the asset, maintain control during my lifetime. Derek did not know about the trust. He had never asked about the legal structure of the property. He had assumed, with the confidence of a man who assumes most things, that the house was simply in my name, an old woman's asset sitting there waiting to be liquidated. What he had produced on that kitchen table was a standard real estate purchase agreement. What he had asked me to sign was a document authorizing him to act as my agent in a sale. What he did not know was that any such sale required trustee authorization. My authorization, given in my capacity as trustee of a trust he didn't know existed. A document signed by Marilyn Hart, the individual, had no legal force to transfer property held by the Marilyn Hart, the trustee. The purchase agreement was, in the plainest terms, unenforceable. I had signed it anyway. I wanted to understand how far he would go. The morning after, I made coffee and I sat at the kitchen table, and I let the fear come through first, because I've learned that trying to think clearly while suppressing fear is like trying to drive with the parking brake on. So I let it come. The fear was this. My son had looked at me and seen a problem to be solved, an inconvenience, a liability. He had brought a stranger to my home and announced my erasure with a smile. He had booked me a room in a waiting place without asking me if I wanted to wait. That fear turned over in me for about 20 minutes. Then it became something else. I got out a yellow legal pad. I still use yellow legal pads. I don't apologize for it. And I started writing. First, call Patricia Sohn. Patricia had drawn up the trust documents and knew every clause. I needed her to confirm what I already believed, that the purchase agreement Derek had presented was legally void, and that any attempt to move forward with a sale would hit a wall the moment a title search was run. Second, document everything. The visit, the buyer, the agreement, Derek's exact words, date, time, context. I wrote it all out in longhand while it was still fresh, then photographed the pages with my phone. Third, understand the scope of Derek's plan. He hadn't done this alone. Tiffany was in it, I was certain of that. And Craig Ellison, the buyer, had been brought in as if the sale were already a settled matter. Had Derek made representations to Ellison about his authority to sell, that could have legal implications of its own. Fourth, and this was the part that had kept me awake, talk to Susan. Susan was my daughter, 51 years old, living in Columbus, named as a successor trustee in the trust documents. She was methodical like me, and she had never liked Tiffany, and she had a quiet lawyer's instinct even though she'd spent her career in hospital administration, not law. Susan would be steady. Susan would not panic. Susan would help me think. I poured a second cup of coffee and sat with the legal pad and looked around my kitchen. The copper-bottomed pots Gerald had bought at a yard sale in 1993. The blue and white tile backsplash I'd put in myself in 2001. The window over the sink that looked out onto the backyard where the last of the season's garden had gone to straw. Derek wanted to put me in Meadowbrook. He wanted to hand my 37 years to Craig Ellison in his clipboard and walk away with a check. I thought about that. I thought about it carefully and completely. Then I picked up the phone. Patricia Sohn had been my estate attorney for 16 years. She was a compact, precise woman in her early 60s who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and kept her office in a Victorian row house on Elm Street that looked like a place where wills went to be taken seriously. She had drawn up Gerald's estate documents, handled the probate after he passed, and structured the trust in 2015. When I called her the morning after Derek's visit and told her what had happened, there was a pause on the line. The specific pause of a professional who is choosing her next words carefully. "Don't speak to Derek about the trust yet," she said. "Don't speak to him about any of this. Come in Thursday." I came in Thursday. I sat across from Patricia's mahogany desk with my yellow legal pad and my photograph notes and the copy of the purchase agreement I'd made before Derek took the original. Patricia put on her reading glasses and went through it page by page. It took about 12 minutes. When she was done, she set it down and looked at me over the frames. "This is unenforceable," she said. "The property is held in the trust. Your signature as an individual has no capacity to authorize a conveyance. The moment a title company runs a search, this falls apart." "I know," I said. "I signed it to see what he'd do with it." Patricia gave me a look that was equal parts professional concern and something that might have been respect. "What do you want to do, Marilyn?" I told her what I wanted. I wanted the trust documented and certified. I wanted a formal legal notice prepared, something that could be sent to Craig Ellison's real estate office clarifying that the property was trust held and that Derek Hart had no authority to represent the seller. And I wanted to know whether Derek's representations to the buyer constituted fraud. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what he told Ellison about his authority. If he represented himself as having power of attorney, or as owner, or as executor of an estate, none of which is true, then yes, there are exposure issues. How do I find out what he told him?" "That," Patricia said, "is something we can investigate. Craig Ellison is a licensed realtor. He will have documentation. A formal inquiry from a trust attorney tends to produce records." I drove home from Patricia's office feeling something I hadn't expected. Calm. Not the brittle calm of someone holding themselves together, but something settled and purposeful. I had a legal fortress around this house that Derek didn't know existed. I had documentation of his actions. I had a clear next step. What I didn't have yet was proof of exactly what Derek had represented to Craig Ellison. That came 3 days later. I had not been passive in those 3 days. I'd called Susan, a long conversation, calm on both our ends, the kind of conversation that made me grateful all over again for the daughter I'd raised. Susan was quietly furious in a way that was more useful than explosiveness. She confirmed she had copies of her trustee designation documents in her own files. She agreed to say nothing to Derek until we were ready. On Saturday afternoon, my neighbor Helen Darby came over for coffee. Helen was 73, sharp as a tack, and had lived on Clover Hill Road almost as long as I had. She mentioned, with the careful casualness of a woman delivering important information, that she'd seen Derek and Tiffany walking around the exterior of my house on Thursday evening. While I was at Patricia's office, they'd been with Craig Ellison. They'd been measuring the front porch. Helen had heard Derek say clearly and without ambiguity that the closing would happen by the end of November. 6 weeks away. Derek had told the buyer the sale was proceeding. He had accepted no signal that anything was wrong because I had given him none. He had moved forward on the assumption that my signature on that piece of paper was all he needed. Sunday evening, I received an email forwarded to me by Patricia. It had required only a formal letter of inquiry to the real estate agency. Ellison worked for Pinnacle Realty on State Street, citing the trust's interest in the property and requesting documentation of the agency agreement. What came back was a copy of the listing agreement Craig Ellison had drawn up. Under seller authorization, Derek had signed as authorized agent and property manager with full authority to act on behalf of the owner. He had put it in writing. He had signed a real estate agency document misrepresenting his legal authority. I sat at my kitchen table and read the email twice. Outside, the October evening was going dark, the streetlights on Clover Hill Road coming on one by one. I thought about Derek walking around my porch with a measuring tape, already spending money that wasn't his to touch. I thought about Meadowbrook and its waiting rooms and its fluorescent lights. I placed the email in the folder I had been building. Then I went to water my houseplants, because they still needed watering regardless of what was happening, and because routine is how I keep my mind from racing. Derek had just made himself legally vulnerable. He had done it in his own handwriting. This was no longer just a family dispute. Patricia sent the letter on a Monday. It was a formal notice on trust letterhead. Gerald and Marilyn Hart Family Trust, Patricia Sohn, Esquire as counsel. Addressed to Craig Ellison at Pinnacle Realty and copied to Pinnacle's managing broker. It stated, plainly and without drama, that the property at 4417 Clover Hill Road was held in trust, that no authorized trustee had approved any listing or sale agreement, that the agency agreement signed by Derek Hart on the trust's behalf was legally invalid, and that any further action taken to advance the purported sale could expose all parties to liability for tortious interference with trust assets. It requested that the listing be withdrawn within 5 business days and that all marketing of the property cease immediately. Patricia told me she expected a response within 48 hours. The response came in 36, but it didn't come from Pinnacle Realty. It came from Derek. He pulled into my driveway on a Wednesday afternoon in a way that was designed to communicate urgency. Too fast, too hard on the brakes. Tiffany was with him. She got out of the passenger side wearing a look I recognized, the look of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say. They walked to my door without knocking, and I opened it before they could, because I had been expecting them and because I wanted to be the one standing in the doorway. "What did you do?" Derek said. "Not hello, not mom. What did you do?" "Come in," I said, and stepped back to let them enter. We sat in the living room. I chose the armchair deliberately, leaving them the sofa, which is lower and softer and puts people at a slight positional disadvantage. Gerald had taught me that without meaning to. He'd been a hospital administrator. He knew about rooms. Derek started with controlled anger, which was his opening mode. He told me that I had embarrassed him in front of Craig Ellison, that I had made him look like a fool in front of Pinnacle Realty, that this was supposed to be simple, that he was doing this for me, that I didn't understand what was involved in maintaining a house at my age. The words came fast and practiced. Tiffany sat next to him and nodded and said things like, "We've been so worried about you, and the house really is too much for one person." I let them finish. I had learned over 70 years that people who are managing a script need to complete it before they can hear anything else. Then I said, very quietly, "Derek, you signed a real estate agency document claiming authority you don't have. That's in writing. I have the copy." The controlled anger slipped, just slightly, like a mask that's been on too long. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I said. "I've known since 2015 when this property was placed in trust. You were never authorized to sell it. You never had power of attorney. You represented yourself to a licensed realtor as having full authority to act on my behalf. And that is not a small thing, Derek." Tiffany leaned forward then. And this was when they shifted tactics, as I'd known they would. "Marilyn," she said, and her voice changed to something soft and concerned. "We're worried about your decision-making. You've been so isolated since Gerald passed. We've talked to your doctor." I looked at her. "You spoke to my doctor?" "Just to express our concerns," she said. "Your age—" "Tiffany." I kept my voice level. "I have a certified estate attorney, an executed trust that had been in place for 11 years, documentation of Derek's unauthorized representations, and a daughter in Columbus who is a named successor trustee and who is fully informed of this situation. If you are suggesting I lack competency, I'd invite you to make that case in a proceeding where all of that will be entered into evidence." The room went quiet. Derek stood up. He was not a man who accepted the end of a conversation gracefully. He said things then that I won't repeat in their entirety. That I was paranoid, that I was going to die alone in this house, that I was throwing away his inheritance, which was, I noted, the most honest thing he'd said since he arrived. He said if I pushed this, he would make sure everyone knew how difficult I was being. He said I would regret it. Tiffany put her hand on his arm. They left. I stood in my own living room and listened to his car back out of my driveway. Then I sat down, and for a few minutes, my hands shook. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from the accumulated weight of having to defend your life from someone who was supposed to love you. That particular exhaustion is different from every other kind. I gave myself 3 days. I called Susan and told her what had happened. I walked every afternoon 2 miles, same route, past the old Kellerman farm and back. I cooked real meals. I watched old movies Gerald had liked. He'd been a devoted fan of Gregory Peck, and let myself simply exist in the house that was mine. I did not answer Derek's calls. I did not read his texts beyond confirming they contained nothing legally relevant. On the 4th day, I was ready again. The communication came through Marilyn's sister-in-law, Bev. Bev was Gerald's younger sister, 70 years old, a retired school teacher who had always tried to be a peacemaker in the way that certain kind people try, with genuine intentions and limited information. She called on a Thursday evening and said Derek had phoned her and that she wanted me to hear what he'd said and that she wasn't taking sides. She just thought I should know. He had told Bev that I was having a breakdown, that I was confused and paranoid, and that the trust document I kept referencing was something Gerald had set up, and that I didn't properly understand it. He said he was terrified for my welfare. He said a mother-son conflict this severe at my age could cause serious psychological harm, and that he was simply trying to get me safe housing before something terrible happened. He had said it with such apparent feeling that Bev had been shaken. I could hear it in her voice, the uncertainty, this is more complicated than I thought quality. That was the design. Derek was not stupid. He knew that in family disputes, the side that controls the narrative of the elder's competency often wins. He was beginning to build that narrative. I let Bev finish. Then I said, calmly and clearly, Bev, the trust document was set up by my attorney in 2015, 11 years ago, when I was 60 years old and in full possession of every faculty I've ever had. I have the original documents. My attorney has copies. My daughter is a named trustee. I'm not confused about any of this. Derek is telling you I'm confused because it's more convenient for him than telling you the truth. There was a pause. Then why would he? Because the house is worth $430,000, I said. Another pause, longer. Oh, said Bev. We talked for another 40 minutes. By the end, Bev wasn't shaken anymore. She was angry, quietly, in the way older women get angry when they realize they've been used as a messenger for a manipulation. She said she was sorry. I told her she didn't need to be sorry. She'd been deceived, and that there was a significant difference between those two things. What I had understood during those 3 days of deliberate rest was that I could not do this entirely alone, not legally. Patricia and Susan were already in that architecture, but I mean in a human sense, the sense of being seen and believed by people in my immediate life, because what Derek was constructing, carefully and with malice, was a story in which I was diminished. And stories like that can take root in communities if you let them, if you stay quiet, if you remain the dignified private widow who doesn't burden anyone with her problems. I had decided not to be that. I made calls, deliberate, considered calls. I called my neighbor, Helen Darby, who had witnessed Derek measuring my porch, and I told her, simply and factually, what was happening. Helen had known me for 31 years. She listened without interruption and at the end said, "That boy always did treat this house like a bank account." She offered to write down what she'd seen the evening Derek brought Ellison around. I thanked her and said yes. I called an older friend, Dorothea Marsh, whom I knew from the hospital's retired employees lunch group. Dorothea had, some years prior, navigated a legal dispute with her own adult children over an estate matter. She'd come out the other side of it, and she was still standing, and she knew things worth knowing. We met for lunch at Perkins on Route 40. She listened to everything over coffee and a slice of pie, and she said, "Get everything in writing. Everything. The moment it's verbal, it becomes your word against theirs." She also mentioned that the local Senior Resource Center had a free legal consultation clinic on the second Tuesday of every month, and that the attorney who ran it was thorough and discreet. I went to the clinic on Tuesday. The attorney there was a young man named Marcus Webb, who wore a slightly too large suit and had the earnest, detail-oriented quality of someone who had chosen elder law because he meant it. I laid out the situation for him: the trust, the unauthorized listing, the competency narrative Derek was building. Marcus listened carefully, asked precise questions, and said, "The misrepresentation to the realtor is the most actionable element. It's black and white. But the competency angle is something to take seriously and get ahead of. A letter from your primary physician documenting your current cognitive and physical status would be useful, not defensive, proactive." I hadn't thought of that. I made a note on my yellow legal pad. My physician was Dr. Anita Campbell. I had been her patient for 12 years. I called her office the following morning and explained what I needed and why. Her nurse called back that afternoon and said Dr. Campbell would provide a letter documenting my general health and cognitive status, and that she did not find this request at all unusual, and that I was not the first patient she'd had in this situation. I was not the first. That landed somewhere. I sat in my kitchen that evening with a cup of tea, and I took stock of what I now had on my side: a trust attorney, a legal document framework Derek couldn't break, a named successor trustee in Susan, a neighbor's written account, a retired peer who'd survived the same thing, a second legal perspective from Marcus Webb, a physician's letter coming, and Bev, Gerald's sister, who'd been deceived and was no longer deceived. Derek had one thing: the false document I'd signed. He was building a story about a confused old woman. I was building a record. They came on a Sunday morning in early November when the light was thin and the yard was stripped down to its November plainness. I saw the car from the kitchen window, Derek's, pulling up slowly, not the hard-breaking urgency of his last visit. Tiffany got out carrying a dish covered in foil, and Derek had his hands free and his expression arranged into something careful. A Sunday visit with a casserole, a performance of normalcy. I stood at the sink and breathed for a moment before going to the door. "Mom," Derek said, and his voice was the version he used for occasions: warm, composed, adult. "We wanted to come and apologize. Last time was—" He shook his head. "We were all worked up. That wasn't right." Tiffany held out the dish. "Chicken and rice. I made it yesterday." I took the dish. I thanked her. I let them in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Derek had slid the purchase agreement across to me in October. And Tiffany served coffee from the pot I'd already made, and Derek folded his hands in front of him and looked at me with the expression of a man attempting to communicate reasonableness. "We want to talk," he said, calmly, as a family. I said nothing. I've found over the years that the person who fills silence first is the person who needs something. He filled it. "I know the house is in a trust," he said. I kept my expression neutral. This was new. He'd done some legal research then, or spoken to someone. I waited. "I know I can't just sell it without your sign-off as trustee." He said this carefully, as if it were a concession, as if acknowledging reality were generosity. "And I'm not trying to force anything. I want you to understand that." Tiffany said, "We love you, Marilyn. We just want what's best for you." Then came the proposal. Derek laid it out in the measured tone of someone who has practiced in front of a mirror. The house, he said, was worth $430,000 on the current market. If it sold, after costs, the net would be approximately $390,000. His proposal was this: I would agree as trustee to authorize the sale to Craig Ellison or another buyer at comparable price. From the proceeds, $70,000 would be placed in a dedicated account for my care expenses at Meadowbrook. The remainder, approximately $320,000, would, he said, go into the trust to be managed for family benefit. Family benefit. I looked at my son across the kitchen table. I thought about what $320,000 in a trust meant when the trustee was Derek, which was the other part of the proposal, the one he hadn't quite said yet. I want to understand, I said, what the governance arrangement would look like. Derek smiled. I'd become co-trustee just to help manage things. Co-trustee, meaning access, meaning eventual control. And my successor trustees as currently named, I said. Well, we'd update those designations, he said, still in the reasonable voice. Simplify things. Simplify things. Susan removed. Marilyn Hart, the trustee, replaced by a version of herself with Derek standing at her elbow. I looked at Tiffany. She was watching me with an expression that had shifted slightly. The warmth was still there, but it was thinner now, and under it something was calculating. She had done the arithmetic on this proposal. She knew what it meant. The chicken and rice dish sat on the counter behind her, and I thought about how much planning went into a Sunday morning with a casserole, and how much of it had nothing to do with love. One more question, I said. The misrepresentation Derek signed at Pinnacle Realty, the agency document, would that be addressed in this arrangement? Withdrawn? Formally? Derek's reasonable expression tightened, just slightly. That's a minor administrative issue, he said. Patricia can sort that out. Patricia, I said, is my attorney. She'd be sorting it out in my interest. Mom! His voice changed. The warmth dropped out of it entirely, and under it was the flat, hard thing I'd heard in my living room the last time. I'm trying to give you a graceful way out of this. You're 70 years old. You are alone. You cannot maintain this property indefinitely. This house will have to be dealt with eventually, and it is better to do it now, while you are capable of making the decision, rather than... He stopped, but we both knew the end of the sentence. Rather than when you're not. Tiffany put her hand on his arm. They looked at each other. Some communication passed between them that required no words. I'll think about it, I said. It was a lie, and they may have known it, but it got them out of my house. Derek stood at the door for a moment before leaving and looked at me in a way that had moved entirely past affection. Don't take too long, he said. Craig Ellison has other properties to consider. If this falls through, I can't promise what comes next. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway with my hand still on the doorknob, and I felt it. The fear, real and specific. Not of losing the house, not anymore, but of the version of me Derek had been constructing, piece by piece. The diminished woman, the problem, the person to be managed. I had seen, across my own kitchen table, that my son looked at me and calculated and felt nothing that I recognized as love. That fear lasted about 2 minutes. Then it cured into something harder. I chose the conference room at Patricia's office. Not my home, not neutral territory. Patricia's conference room, with the long oak table and the document binders and the Pennsylvania State Bar certificate on the wall, where everything that happened would happen in the context of law and record. I had spent the preceding 2 weeks making certain that what happened in that room would be conclusive. Susan drove up from Columbus the night before. She stayed in the guest room, Gerald's old study, and we sat up past 11 talking the way we hadn't in years, over decaf and the good shortbread cookies I'd bought at Tiedemann's Bakery. She had brought her own file folder, her trustee designation documents, Gerald's original estate paperwork, the copy of the trust amendment I'd filed in 2015. She had flagged every relevant page with color-coded tabs. I had raised a thorough daughter. Dr. Campbell's letter had arrived. It was a single page, professionally written, documenting that Marilyn Hart was in good general health, that there was no clinical indication of cognitive decline, and that she demonstrated full capacity for independent decision-making. I had read it 3 times. The 3rd time I had put it down and been, briefly, grateful for my health, for a physician who meant her oath, for the fact that I had thought to ask. Helen Darby's written statement about the evening she had seen Derek, Tiffany, and Craig Ellison measuring my porch was in the folder. Bev, Gerald's sister, who had been used as an unwitting messenger, had also, after considerable reflection and a long second conversation with me, put her account in writing. She had confirmed the exact language Derek had used, that I was confused, that the trust document was something I didn't understand, that I was not fully capable. Her account was dated and signed. Marcus Webb had reviewed the full file the week prior and had produced a 2-page legal summary of the situation, the trust's validity, Derek's unauthorized actions, the specific exposure created by the signed agency agreement at Pinnacle Realty. It was written to be clear to a layperson. I invited Derek and Tiffany to a meeting at my attorney's office to discuss the family property matter. Derek came. He brought a man I didn't recognize, a lawyer of his own, I realized, a younger man with a leather folder and the wariness of someone who'd been brought in late and hadn't been told everything. That was interesting. That told me Derek was either more frightened than he'd shown or more serious about pushing forward than I'd hoped. Either way, it changed nothing. We sat down, Patricia at the head of the table, Susan to my right, Derek and his attorney across from us. Tiffany had not come. I noted that. Patricia opened. She was brief and precise in the way that I had learned meant she was fully prepared. She placed the trust documents on the table. The original, the 2015 amendment, the recorded deed. She walked through the ownership structure in 4 minutes. Derek's attorney, I could see, was reading the pages quickly, and the set of his expression was changing as he read. Then Patricia placed the Pinnacle Realty Agency agreement, the one with Derek's signature under authorized agent with full authority to act on behalf of the owner, on the table. Derek looked at it. His face was controlled. This document, Patricia said, constitutes a misrepresentation of legal authority to a licensed real estate agency. It exposes Mr. Hart to potential liability for fraudulent misrepresentation, and potentially Craig Ellison and Pinnacle Realty as well if they conducted any marketing activities or incurred costs on the basis of it. Derek's attorney put his hand on Derek's arm, a small gesture. Hold. Then Patricia placed Dr. Campbell's letter, Helen's statement, Bev's statement. She placed Marcus Webb's summary. "We're not here to litigate," Patricia said. "We're here to make the situation clear and to establish a formal record of this meeting. Marilyn Hart is the sole trustee of this trust. She has not authorized any sale. She has not designated Derek Hart as her agent. She is, as the attached medical letter confirms, fully competent to manage her own affairs. Derek's attorney leaned over and said something quietly. Derek shook his head, and here is where the composure failed. It was the Bev letter that did it, I think. When his attorney turned to that page and Derek saw the letterhead and recognized the handwriting, his aunt, the woman he'd used. I saw him understand in real time that he had fewer people on his side than he'd believed. This is, he started and stopped, and started again. She had no right. Bev had no... He looked at me. Did you coach her? Did you put words in her mouth? Her statement reflects what you said to her, I said. In her words, not mine. This whole thing is... He pushed back from the table slightly, a physical manifestation of losing his footing. You're doing this to hurt me. You've always chosen Susan over me. You have always. Since Dad died, you have. This is about the inheritance. You want Susan to have everything? Derek. His own attorney now, with the firmness of a man cutting his losses. She was going to leave it all to Susan anyway. His voice had risen. The conference room was very quiet, and in that quiet his words sat there, nakedly, with no narrative architecture left to dress them up. The whole trust, I looked at the documents, I know what it says. Susan gets primary succession, I get... He stopped. He had, in that moment, in front of 2 attorneys and his sister and a paper record, confirmed that he had read the trust documents, that he had known about the trust, that the entire performance, the confusion, the surprise, the claim that he was simply trying to help, had been exactly that, a performance. His attorney gathered his folder with the precise movements of a man who wished he were somewhere else. The room was very quiet. I looked at my son. I thought about the 3rd step on the staircase that still creaked the way it had when he was a boy. I thought about how much I had wanted not to be sitting in this room. The Pinnacle listing should be withdrawn by Friday, Patricia said to Derek's attorney. All documentation of the purported sale should be voided. We'll need written confirmation. She slid a prepared document across the table. If your client would like to avoid further proceedings, signature today would accomplish that. Derek's attorney read it. He had the look of someone doing a rapid cost-benefit calculation. He passed it to Derek. Derek signed. He held the pen for a long moment, long enough that I watched it and understood that he was performing resistance, one last time, for his own dignity. Then his attorney said something quietly, and Derek moved the pen across the bottom of the document and slid it back across the table. Patricia reviewed it, initialed her witness line, and handed a copy to Derek's attorney. Her expression didn't change. She'd been doing this for 30 years. Thank you, Patricia said. We'll follow up with formal confirmation of the Pinnacle withdrawal by end of week. Derek stood. He didn't look at me. He walked to the door of the conference room and stopped there. And for a moment, I thought he was going to say something. Some version of a final word, the kind that's not really for the other person, but for yourself. But his attorney was already at his shoulder, and whatever Derek had intended to say, he let it go. The door closed behind them. The conference room was quiet. Susan reached under the table and put her hand over mine. Neither of us said anything for a moment. I'll draft the confirmation to Pinnacle today, Patricia said. She was already making notes. Craig Ellison's broker will be relieved. They've been sitting on this for weeks knowing something wasn't right. By Thursday of that week, Pinnacle Realty had formally withdrawn the listing. Their managing broker sent a written statement, carefully worded, the language of an agency distancing itself from liability, confirming that the listing agreement had been executed in error, that no authorized trustee had sanctioned the listing, and that all marketing materials were being removed. Craig Ellison, for his part, had apparently known for some time that the paperwork was thin. He had proceeded on Derek's confidence rather than on due diligence. He would not make that mistake again. Patricia also sent a formal cease and desist to Derek directly, a letter documenting the misrepresentation, the trust's legal status, and the consequences of any future unauthorized attempt to act on the trust's behalf. It was, in Patricia's words, prophylactic. It was also, I thought, very satisfying. The competency narrative Derek had been building collapsed, and it collapsed the way things collapse when they were never structurally sound to begin with. The mechanism was Bev. I hadn't asked her to do anything, but Bev, once she understood the full scope of what had happened, had a conversation with Derek's cousin Raymond, and another with Gerald's oldest friend, Martin Pruitt, who had known our family for 40 years. She didn't spread gossip. Bev wasn't that kind of person. She simply told the truth. She told people what Derek had said to her and what he had actually done and what the legal situation was. And in the way of families and small communities, that truth moved. By the end of November, the people in our extended family and long-term social circle who had heard Derek's version of events had now heard the other version, the one with documents attached. There were real consequences for Derek beyond the family. I learned, through Patricia's follow-up work, that Craig Ellison had filed a complaint with the Ohio Real Estate Commission regarding the fraudulent agency agreement. Not a criminal matter. The commission dealt in professional ethics and civil consequences, but serious. Derek faced a formal finding of misrepresentation in connection with a licensed real estate transaction. This was documented. It was, in the dry language of such proceedings, part of the record. Derek had also borrowed against a personal line of credit in anticipation of the sale proceeds, 2 months of interest payments on a deal that no longer existed. The amount wasn't enormous, but the loss was real, and the embarrassment was realer. Tiffany, I heard through Bev, who heard through Raymond, had been furious, not at the failure of the scheme, but at the exposure, at the public nature of it, at the fact that her name was on certain documents adjacent to Derek's. There was a particular justice in that I had not planned for and did not regret. I drove home from Patricia's office on the Thursday of the Pinnacle withdrawal along Clover Hill Road, past the Kellerman farm, past Helen Darby's house, where the porch light was already on in the late afternoon November dark. I pulled into my own driveway and sat in the car for a moment and looked at the house, the cream colonial with the green shutters, the porch where someone had once measured the railing, the dining room window where Gerald's afternoon light would fall again tomorrow and the day after that. I thought about what it had taken to stay in it. I got out of the car, I went inside, I put the kettle on. The house was mine. It had always been mine. But now there was a paper record that said so, and a great many people who understood exactly what had been attempted and exactly how it had ended. That felt different. That felt like the difference between a private truth and a witnessed one. By the following spring, the vegetable garden was back. I turned the beds in April and put in tomatoes, beans, and the border of marigolds Gerald had started in 1994. Susan came up from Columbus and we planted the seedlings together in a thin morning drizzle, then had a long lunch at the Italian place on Madison Avenue and split a bottle of Chianti and talked for 4 hours. Helen Darby and I had fallen into a Tuesday coffee habit, back and forth between our houses, that I valued more than I could easily say. I'd also joined Marcus Webb's senior legal clinic as a volunteer, helping people navigate elder law matters twice a month. I listened to frightened people and told them what I wished someone had told me. The fear is information, and you have more options than you think. Bev came for Thanksgiving with her daughter Lena. I made Gerald's mother's stuffing from the 3x5 card in his handwriting, still kept in the kitchen drawer. It was a good Thanksgiving. Derek received a formal misrepresentation finding from the Ohio Real Estate Commission, a 5-year notation in the state registry, quiet but permanent. The line of credit he'd taken out in anticipation of the sale cost him months of interest on a deal that never existed. By spring, he and Tiffany were in marriage counseling. I held no pleasure in that, only the ordinary sadness of watching a family fracture, even when the fracturing was earned. What I had was enough. A house I defended, a daughter who was my trustee and my friend, a neighbor, a garden, Gerald's recipe in the drawer. I was 70 years old and I was not waiting. That is the story. A house, a trust, and a son who mistook silence for surrender. What I learned is simple. Preparation is power. Documentation is dignity. And the people who truly love you do not need you diminished to feel safe. I never raised my voice. I never panicked. I simply knew what was true, found the people who could help me prove it, and waited for the right moment. If someone is rewriting your story without your permission, remember, you're allowed to hold the pen. What would you have done in my place? Leave a comment. I read everyone. Share this with someone who might need it. And thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening.